Hello and welcome. You've found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. Today's episode is the second of a two-part series about experimental research design with Dr. Bruce Thayer. Dr. Thayer is a distinguished research professor, former dean with the College of Social Work at Florida State University, founding and current editor of the journal Research on Social Work Practice, and author of the 2023 Columbia University Press book, Experimental Research Designs in Social Work, Theory and Application. Now, in the last episode, 144, Dr. Thayer gave a historical episode of social workers and experimental design. In today's episode, Dr. Thayer unpacks how social work practitioners can think about experimental research in their own practice. We explore why you don't need to be embarrassed if you find research experiments intimidating, but why critically appraising research, including randomized experiments, is a core expectation for all social workers. Now, Dr. Thayer shares practical tools like the CONSORT-SPI checklist to help you evaluate studies and encourages you to respectfully challenge your professors about empirical evidence behind the therapies that they teach. We'll also tackle some of the challenges and biases in social work against experimental designs, the inherent risks of empirical studies where results might not confirm expectations, and the ethical considerations when designing interventions, especially for serious issues like suicide prevention. Plus, we'll clarify the difference between true experiments and quasi-experiments, often mistakenly called natural experiments, and understand why precise research is vital, sometime with its full value recognized much later. If you want a refresher on some of the terms Dr. Thayer uses in this episode, you can check out his book, Experimental Research Designs in Social Work, Theory and Application, or go to socialworkpodcast.com for a glossary of terms used in this episode. And now, without further ado, on to episode 145 of the Social Work Podcast, Experimental Research Design Part 2, an interview with Dr. Bruce Thayer. So Bruce, you and I are both PhD trained researchers and scholars, and I think a lot of what you're talking about applies really well to doctoral level social workers. But most of the folks that are listening to this podcast are MSW students, BSW students. They're going to be practitioners. What words of wisdom do you have for them? What advice or cautions do you have if they're listening to this thinking, wow, that's the experimental designs, I can do them, they're doable, they've got a lot of value. What would you say to them?
I would say don't be embarrassed if you don't think that RCTs or other types of experiments are beyond your capacity. You know, we don't expect our family medical doctor to do randomized experiments in his or her practice. We don't expect our dentist to do that or anything. But what we can do and what we can and should expect of all BSW students and MSW students is that they have learned to read and critically appraise different types of studies, descriptive studies, survey studies, all kinds, including randomized experiments. And as you know, there have been some checklists that have been written that are publicly available. One is called CONSORT-SPI, which stands for Consolidated Reporting Standards for Randomized Trials, hyphen social and psychosocial interventions. And if you do CONSORT-SPI, you can find it on Google. And this is like a 25-item checklist that a reader of an article can use to see, did the writers of this paper cover all the major points? Think of a pilot doing a checklist before setting off on their plane, or a surgeon doing a checklist before he or she begins surgery. An author of an experiment should follow the consort to write it up and make sure no crucial information is omitted. And a reader of an experiment can use the consort the consort checklist to look and guide their analysis about how people were recruited and how are the participants described and were measures taken properly pre-test and post-test. So no, BSWs and MSWs are not expected to routinely do experiments. I recognize that. But by golly, they really need to be able to read it, just like your medical doctor needs to be able to read the latest experimental research that occurs in medicine in his or her discipline. So become familiar with it, because experiments give you the very best judgment about what the true effects of treatment are. And I would encourage students in class to ask their professor, particularly in practice classes, to raise their hand respectfully and say something like, Dr. X, I'm really interested in learning more about this therapy. Can you tell me of any randomized trials that have tested this therapy and been shown to have positive effects? And see what your professor says. A good professor will have that information at the tip of their fingers, and they'll be able to provide it to you. Another good result is for them to say, that's a great question. I'll get back to you next week in class, and I'll give you the citations. What you don't want to tolerate is a professor who says something like, well, we shouldn't worry about that. We should just rely upon the authority of the field or our clinical intuition, or how dare you challenge me as the professor. You don't want to be challenging. You want to be friendly. You want to say, I'd like to learn more about these different types of treatments. Let's say mindfulness, which does have a good body of research behind it. And a good professor will acquaint the students with the available evidence about the effects of interventions that they teach, and I would hope preferentially teach about in practice classes interventions that do have a good degree of empirical support, and not about things that are not well supported.
So let's say a student uses this CONSORT checklist, goes through, and the article checks all the boxes. What might a clinician, a practitioner, still want to be critically thinking about some of the downsides of experiments, even when they check all the boxes?
Well, sometimes experimental interventions can be pretty expensive. If you're doing an analysis of long-term psychotherapy, that can cost a lot of money, particularly if you have a lot of people assigned your different conditions. So that may be one reason why we don't see as many experimental studies on long-term therapies. So that can be a downside. It doesn't say they don't lend themselves to such analysis, and RCTs are still the best way to evaluate the outcomes of therapies, long-term or short-term. But certainly if you're doing something that you expect is not going to have an impact until 6 months have gone by or 1 year gone by of weekly sessions, that's going to lend itself less well to doing a true experiment. So that's certainly a downside. Another downside will be your colleagues, whether it be in your BSW or MSW internship or your doctoral training, and you say, I'd like to learn more about experiments. I'd like to read them. Or as a dissertation student, you'd say, I'd like to do an experiment. Will be a faculty member says, oh no, those are too hard. You shouldn't do those. You should give them my book and say, look, there's over 1,000 that have been done. We can do this together. And I'm really interested more, not in a survey, not in a correlational investigation, not in a secondary data analysis. I want to do a study that really tries to help people and see what the effects are. And so try and walk in and be prepared to be a little assertive in your, if you do have a true interest in doing an experiment, don't let anybody deter you. Try and persuade them that it is possible, and maybe write up a little simple proposal of how you might do an experiment for your dissertation. Way back in 1987, I wrote an article in the Journal on Social Work Education encouraging all doctoral students to consider doing outcome studies and experiments for their doctoral dissertations in social work. Even we see the rise of the DSW program, and the students have to do some type of capstone project. We don't think of the DSW as being a research-intensive degree, but if you go on the website of the University of Pennsylvania DSW program, you'll find out that their capstone project is actually called a dissertation. And they provide examples of the types of projects students can do for their DSW dissertation, and that the high end is to do a randomized controlled study of a social work intervention. So even DSW programs are encouraging students to do this type of research, and I think that's a good move.
Another thing that I thought about when you were talking, though, is that if you're pinning all your hopes on treatment A being better than treatment B, but then it turns out they're not, right, that they're the same, that's something that you also have to be aware of and okay with as a researcher, that maybe your experiment will show that there's no difference.
You're absolutely right. You put your finger on an important point. Doing experiments is risky. Doing any type of empirical study is risky. And we need to adopt the mindset, or the behavior, if you will, that we're not trying to prove that something works or doesn't work. We're trying to see if it works. We're trying to find out what the effects of an intervention are and not be wedded to proving that something works. Now, if you've had extensive training in one type of therapy, there's going to be a natural bias on your part, but you can help control for that by using independent evaluators to do the pre-test and post-test with your participants. You can have an independent statistician to do the analyses. So you can try and control for things using techniques like that. And you really have to be permitted to finding out what nature tells us, not what you already decided you want to find out.
Now, what about situations where withholding a treatment could be dangerous? Like, for example, my area is suicide, right? And if there's a suicide prevention program that has been shown to reduce suicide ideation or increase the number of youth that report having ideation to adults who can then refer them out for treatment, how would you do an experiment where you would have half of the kids not get the intervention? That seems to be ethically dubious.
And you're absolutely right. And we would never want to design an experiment that would put people at risk in a situation like you've described. First of all, I would not imagine a social worker would want to do such a study because of the risk element. And I'm also quite sure that your local institutional review board would not approve something like that. So some things may not lend themselves to a no treatment comparison. But let's say if the treatment was brief, you could compare immediate treatment to delayed treatment. That might get through the IRB and might not be too risky for people. But I think an experiment may well be called for, even if the problem is serious, if the intervention that you're testing is of completely unknown usefulness. If you have an intervention, you don't know if it's going to work at all, I don't see it's unethical to provide people a waitlist control group, for example. But you're absolutely right, where people are going to engage in self-injury or hurt other people or something like that, then a no-treatment control group would not be desirable at all. We'd have to do something else. We might do a quasi-experiment, for instance. Those can be extremely useful as well, and in some cases provide causal inference. But generally speaking, experiments are better for causal inference than quasi-experiments.
Now, during the pandemic, a lot of people called what happened in schools, in workplaces, all across society, natural experiments, where they were able to say, this is what people did before the pandemic, and then there was shelter-in-place orders, or people wore masks, or this sort of thing. And let's just use schools again as example, because it's an institution where at least for 2 weeks, like every school in the country was shut down, and there were only a small group of kids that were going to those schools. And those were typically kids with severe disabilities whose providers were in the schools. If you were measuring something that, you were measuring up to March 13th, and then you had data March 13th to, say, April 1st, would that be considered a natural experiment, or is that not considered an experiment in the way you've been talking about it?
Generally, experiments involve the deliberate manipulation of an intervention or some other type of independent variable. So the term natural experiments is around. For example, one state raises its minimum wage and an adjacent state doesn't, and you might want to look at the effects of unemployment. Some people say that if you raise the minimum wage, unemployment will go up among low-cost service workers. Those type of natural experiments have occurred, but the intervention was not randomly assigned to one group or another's. Those can be very informative, and they don't lend themselves to true experimental studies. Like, we can't randomly assign half the states to get one thing and half the states to the other. But I will point out that I think people are becoming pretty sensitive to the value of experiments, because early on there was pushback against government mandates about some things because they didn't have adequate experimental evidence, like the use of cloth masks. There were people that said, this is stupid. There's no evidence that these help people, and they were publishing that, and it was causing controversy. And the fact is, cloth masks don't help. The N95 mask can help. But another thing, this is January, right now, it's January of 2023. Last week, Dr. Fauci...
2024.
24, sorry. Dr. Fauci said that the 6-foot distance mandate that was put in place in schools and other places. Remember the little dots on the road and the sidewalks and things like that? There was absolutely no cross-scientific evidence to support that whatsoever. And I think that now that that is known, if they ever have a return of an epidemic, there's going to be a lot of resistance to people going back to having a 6-foot distance mandate, because think of the incredible inconvenience it was to schools. They had to reduce class sizes and things like that. These are not decisions without consequences. So the best way we have to make decisions about the wearing of particular types of masks or distancing or something like that is to do experiments whenever that's possible. And sometimes we have to be nimble and work really quick to do the types of studies, and that was done in the case of masks real quick. So yes, natural experiments are a good thing to do, but they're actually more properly called a quasi-experiment because they weren't deliberately assigned to different conditions.
That's really helpful. And also, as you're speaking, it makes me think that sometimes the real value of an experiment is later on. Because if somebody had done experiments where they said, okay, so for this aerosol projection, what is the distance? How far does this go? What is the, in terms of like exposure? Like, what is that? In the moment, somebody might be like, well, that's kind of esoteric fundamental research. But a pandemic hits, and suddenly the CDC says, well, we need experiment-based guidelines to tell people how far away they can stand without being at risk for contracting COVID, right? And so the real value might come later, which doesn't diminish the importance of it being an experiment in the first place, but the value of it is actually later. And I think that's an interesting thing for social workers to think about as well.
I agree with you completely. And to give an example of usefulness of quasi-experiments, the country of Denmark has a really wonderful healthcare system. It keeps meticulous detail of everybody's health records. And in the 1990s, they looked at a cohort of about 400,000 kids. And in the natural course of parenting, about 300,000 of the kids got vaccinations when they were very young, and about 100,000 didn't. Their parents didn't give them vaccines. Then they followed this cohort of 400,000 or so, and they found out that the incidence of autism was no higher in the group that got vaccinations than the group that did not. That is very strong evidence of a quasi-experimental nature. Vaccinations do not cause autistic spectrum disorder. So by no means am I minimizing the value of other types of research like quasi-experiments, because they can be tremendously informative under certain conditions.
That's amazing. Well, Bruce, this has been, as always, informative and fascinating and inspiring. Any final words for the listeners about experimental design, other than, obviously, to get your book?
Yeah, I would encourage BSW and MSW students to be sure and ask their professors to talk about experimental research in the classes that they teach, and to use the standards of good quality experiments to critically evaluate research studies that they look at in the social work and other disciplinary literature. I would really encourage doctoral students to consider doing an experiment for their PhD or DSW projects, and I would really encourage social work faculty to consider applying for grants to enable them to do experiments, because that's really one of the best ways that we're going to be able to see whether or not the services that we provide as a profession actually help people. And that's going to determine the long-term survivability of our discipline.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.